Hello and welcome back to Protect Life here at Breaking the Consensus. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. Before we start, I'd like to invite you to see the old subscribe button there. If you can press that, click on that, then any new material that we use, you will be advised of it. There's also the donate button there. Anything you can give, if you can give something, will be greatly appreciated to help us in the work that we do. Tonight, we're joined again by, as they say, an old friend of the program. Alan Hynes of the Catholic Education Partnership. There's been a bit of activity in the media
Mm.
referring to SPHE in the last few weeks on a couple of different areas. So, Alan, before we start, for people who are joining us again, and maybe as a quick refresher, if you could just give us an overview of what SPHE is, what it's replacing, and what its job is.
Okay, well, in a sense, it's social, personal, and health education, SPHE. Now, it used to be a distinct subject from RSE, so it's relationship sexuality education. But what's happened now is that effectively the NCCA decided to put both together. So RSE is now part of SPHE. So the NCCA, the State Department of Education, have been kind of a cycle of curricular renewal at all levels. So senior cycle, the leaving cert, junior cycle, the junior cert, and a primary level. That's been going on for the last few years. So SPHE has just been on that cycle as well. The first one was the junior cycle SPHE, which was launched in schools in September last year. And then we expected senior cycle SPHE to be ready for launch this September, but the minister delayed approval of the final draft of that curriculum. So it won't, schools will have the option of kind of moving towards it this year, but it won't formally actually be in schools the next year. And then the primary renewal is a bit more substantial. So it's looking, not only has RSE been kind of put into SPHE, but SPHE itself is now part of as well-being. So primary level, that new curriculum will be coming in slowly over the next couple of years. And SPHE won't be the only curricular area where there'll be new subject specifications. So this is just part of that cycle. So it too will probably launch in September next year. So we'll see both primary and senior cycle SPHE, the new curriculum specs, come into force at that point.
So, what we've seen, the only one we've seen so far really in action then is the junior cert, right? Is that
The
right?
junior cert, yeah, or and again, the minister delayed kind of. So there was a draft that had been produced in the autumn. So if you can imagine the autumn preceding the start of the next school year. So if I can get all my dates in my head, like autumn 2023, basically, a draft came out. A final version, on based on feedback, that draft was changed in some ways, and it was sent to the minister in February for approval, but she didn't do anything with it until May. And it was only in May that she approved it, and then it was launched in September last year. The difficulty then was a lot of textbook suppliers, schools, had created textbooks based on the draft specification, not the one that was finally approved. And they're the textbooks that are in school in a lot of schools now. Um, so I think this time the department, hoping to avoid a similar thing, given that there has been a delay in the ministerial approval of this, has basically shoved out the effective date. Again, it's to make sure that we don't get the same problem with senior cycle, where the textbooks are based on an earlier, slightly more radical draft than
Hmm.
the final one was approved. Yeah.
So, just in general sense, social, personal health education. So, what does this cover? I mean, what kind of areas, what kind of issues are going to be addressed?
Well, some of it's actually, I mean, some of it's quite positive. So the usual fare that would have been in there, let's say, was a lot of stuff around anti-bullying, which is important, and it's part of the anti-bullying strategy of schools. But a lot of young people came forward and basically said, look, we're getting an awful lot of this anti-bullying stuff. Can we look at other aspects of our relationships? And similarly, let's say on something like RSE, the feedback again that you would have got from young people was we've heard an awful lot about the S. We'd actually like to know more about relationships. Because as anybody watching this who's a parent will know, the emotional and kind of social life of teenagers, I'm talking from experience here, is quite dramatic. So young people themselves are actually interested, like what are healthy relationships, what are unhealthy relationships? And I'm talking about just friendship relationships, where's
Mm.
exploitation? How do they deal with difficult relationships within maybe family circles or within friend circles? Not bullying, but just difficult, right? and they just wanted a space to explore all that. So the NCCA put that kind of stuff in there. The stuff in there, let's say, on abuse around alcohol or drugs, just to teach people, our young people about the potential harms and downside of those. There is stuff in there about pornography, which got a lot of negative coverage. I am happy to say the NCCA, I mean, their intention was that it be looked at as something that was an activity that causes harm. They've made that far more explicit in the senior cycle SPHE, where even the definition of pornography that's contained in that is quite negative. I mean, as in it's negative against pornography, not only recognizing the ill effects it has on maybe people who use it, but also the kind of social effects that arise from the making of it.
Hmm.
So this is, I suppose very much where we would have hoped them to go. Again, to kind of maybe go back over old ground, there had been a push to kind of have a sex positive view of pornography that it came from particularly kind of study or some university academic departments and from within the HSE, but this had been resisted by the department. So you would have got those aspects, and then you would have obviously got into actual, let's say, stuff around consent in terms of that, various different sexual orientations, and then aspects that wish to look at gender as an issue.
On the issue
So
of
it's a broad subject. Yeah.
Yeah, so just specific on the issue of say relationships in the context of friendships, but also romantic relationships. One of the criticisms that was made of the context, if you like, of the relationship, was that coming from this perspective of sex positivity, which seems to
Mhm.
me to be framing the discourse very deliberately in a certain kind of a way, because if you're not sex positive, then you must be sex negative.
Yeah.
Was that there was a lot of talk about it in a certain way, but there was almost little or no talk about love or
Yeah.
marriage, for example, that it was all just simply about this kind of the physical component of the physical sense of pleasure that
Yeah.
about sexuality. Is that a fair criticism, do you think?
Oh, it is. I mean, in all three submissions we made for all three levels, we'd go back and say, like, you've left out loving relationship or love. And it seemed extraordinary. In all three cases, they conceded it. And the word love or loving now appears in all three documents. But it just seems strange to me that there was a kind of a hesitancy
Mm.
about talking about relationships having the function of love. So, I mean, you're, because I suppose, what else comes with love? There's senses of commitment or whatever else. From a Catholic point of view, obviously just to talk about consent as some kind of dry tick box legal exercise that needs to be engaged in to check if the sexual relations you're about to enter into are okay, just seems a little weird from a Catholic point of view, because obviously the location of sexual activity within marriage implies a relationship where people already know each other, trust each other, dare I say it, even love each other. So there's the context where consent takes place from a Catholic point of view, just be a little bit different, because there'd be a deeper understanding of the other person before you ever get to the point of actually checking for consent. So it presents a kind of weird um, idea of what the human person is, because it almost seemed to be devoid, maybe, of, well, just those feelings that actually bind us together, love, or dare I say it, even some negative emotions. It was that kind of emotional life seemed unacknowledged, except in the driest kind of language. So it's, I think, when you hear particularly parties on the left talking about bringing in objective sex education, it makes it sound like something that's very dry and technical. Where, I mean, this is an area of human life that is anything but. And I just think that's where, again, the kind of messy reality of human relations just went very unacknowledged. So that kind of unreality, I think, was one of the maybe the more interesting things, both in terms of sexual relationships, but also non-sexual relationships. And again, the vast majority of the relationships we have in our life, unless you're a very strange person, are non-sexual. You know, uh, they're non-sexual relationships. They're friends, they're family, they're work colleagues, whatever else. And again, to kind of take the human factor out of that just seemed profoundly weird, or not to acknowledge that, in fact, the richness of our relationships, and even that we can love each other without any kind of sexual component, to not at least open up that discussion and tease it out, again, just seemed to be very incomplete anthropology. But that's a criticism we would have right across several, I mean, large chunks of the curriculum. It's just that the state is operating on a poor understanding of what it is to be a human being. And I think that's, one of the things we need to bring to bear.
But even the framing the question that way, that this is going to be objective,
Yeah,
is kind of dishonest, isn't it? Because really what they're saying is our ideological or philosophical position is somehow neutral and yours
yeah.
is value loaded, when in fact they're bringing their own sets of values, and the notion that they are in some sense scientific, derived from principles or axioms, is not really true.
No, I mean, it's funny enough. Well, in response to something else I wrote recently, Atheist Ireland were quoting a judgment from the High Court that recognised secularism as a distinct philosophical point of view deserving of respect and protection under law. Now, the thing is, it's kind of been quoted against, shall we say, state schools. But if anything, it actually just bolsters the argument because it isn't just some kind of neutral belief system. It is a distinct philosophical worldview, absolutely deserving of some kind of protection under law. That's the whole point, though. It is a distinct view. It's not a neutral view. I think the other thing is just objective is a problem when you're talking about human relationships, because the whole point is we ought not to encounter each other as objects. And get a little bit philosophical.
Mm-hmm.
Like we meet each other as fellow experiencing subjects of being. Now, I just mean we recognize each other, another person who's looking out, experiencing this world. Another I, an ego, whatever you want to call it, but like another I looking out, experiencing the world. They're not. So it's Roger Scruton would have talked a lot about this. It's I thou, not me and this object. We don't
Mm-hmm.
encounter human beings. And in fact, to encounter other human beings as objects, we know grave evil arrives from that kind of perspective on life. And if anything, I mean, this is where, and again, it's just back to a poor anthropology, I think, because and it's funny, it's almost like a reluctance, perhaps even a fear to engage with that full view of what is to be human. To try
Yeah.
and kind of prevent a drier view, just to make
Well,
it easier to deal with in some
I,
ways.
again, I suppose if we're being philosophical, I suppose it seems to me what you're saying is that there's a risk with certain kinds of approach, that rather than seeing other human beings as subjects, like we're subjects, you see them as instruments for our
Yes.
pleasure, for example, our
Yeah.
use.
Yeah.
And that a very famous German philosopher once said that human being we must always be treated as ends in themselves, not means.
Yeah.
Not something that we use to get what we want, but they have to be respected as ends in themselves, as we regard ourselves as an end in
Yeah.
themselves. And that if we get to that, then we see them as instruments, and that's a very debasing and
Yeah.
dehumanizing way to encounter people. But so,
Absolutely. Yeah. I know that they're caught a little bit highfalutin, but there's actually a really important point in there because
mhm.
yeah. Anyway,
And that would have been the core, for example, of the philosophy, the theology of the body of John
yeah,
Paul II, I would say.
correct. Absolutely. Yeah. Very
Now,
much so. Yeah.
we talked sort of in a very general sense about the way that things like sexuality and relations are approached, but there's been quite a bit of controversy in some of the textbooks that have been used using SPHE, and I suppose two issues have come up. One is the way that the issue around gender slash sex, and I think we've seen very often this conflation and confusion, sex, gender, sex, which I suspect may be deliberate because it's kind of a sliding scale depending on the use. On one hand, anyway, that issue, which I'm interested, how is that being approached? And the other one is, say, for example, about the nature of identity, but not just gender identity, but national identity and things. So, uh, what's been going on there?
Okay. Well, that's been quite interesting in the primary curriculum. Now I think they're going to take some of this feedback on board and adjust. But there were in large aspects of the primary curriculum a kind of sense of that the person was a citizen of their local area and then of the world.
Hmm.
Right? So that it was constantly kind of asking the child to engage with themselves in the sense of within their own community, which is fine. But then the next leap was just like full global citizen. And you had, let's say, in a subject like art or music, again, it was just kind of deal with the very local and then just suddenly up into world culture as if, and this is not to disparage Chinese culture, I'm just using an example, as if Chinese culture has as much relevance to Irish culture as let's say our European colleagues. we all know that there's a dynamic relationship between ourselves and our nearest neighbours, both in the UK and beyond, onto the continent of Europe, that informs a lot of the art and culture and literature and music of Irish culture. It's a dynamic relationship. It's far more dynamic with those near influences than they are, let's say, with China. But this curriculum was almost asking the child to encounter various different world cultural aspects on an equal basis as if they're all kind of equally relevant. And it just kind of presented, again, it's kind of like an individual that isn't really properly rooted in any sense of place and culture, or any sense maybe of a history that informs where they and the world as they find it around them today are. So again, it was just a really weird, and the European dimension was almost entirely absent from the history curriculum. It just seemed really, really strange. Over and over again, it was just leaping. Yes, there was a bit of national history, but then it kind of leapt to the world. The other strange thing, and kind of, some people might have raised eyebrows that we raised this, but there was no mention, let's say, in terms of women's history, which normally would have been focus of a lot of historiography recently, even in terms of looking at the struggle for women to gain the vote or gain civil rights. You would have just expected even to see it, maybe, given the progressive nature of much prevailing opinion, that was completely left out. Now, that just seemed a very odd absence to me. And again, when we came to the language curriculum, it kind of just jumped from, well, there's English and Irish, and then suddenly every other language is in the school will get kind of equal treatment. And it doesn't matter if the school is trying to teach Mandarin Chinese or some, sorry, my brain is frozen, but other languages, regardless of where they are, rather than, let's say, looking at languages like French, Spanish, or German, which are most commonly taught in our post-primary schools, these are linked together. It was almost like you just treat the Chinese language as relevant to ourselves in Ireland as French, German, or Spanish. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Again, it was just over and over again a kind of a weird, this global citizen thing that ran right through it. And it was
But
kind of
even
trying to
more
give
than
the
that,
child, yeah,
sorry, there was one that caused quite a bit of controversy. Some of our viewers may not be aware of it, and maybe you can describe it. I think you know what I'm talking about.
mm,
Where two families are contrasted, and it was odd. If it had been done even a little bit differently, you might like it or dislike it, but you could see the point. But it felt like there was almost a despite
yeah,
of creating this family, which was a conglomeration of if a series of, you could call them stereotypes or classic Irish
yeah.
tropes, and this was negative, and the rejection of that was cosmopolitan, open, and global and positive.
So I think what you got there, now in fairness, the NCCA did not approve that textbook and they didn't write it. But a textbook company hired a writer who looked at some of the specifications, saw this kind of strange reluctance, and a kind of a global citizen thing that we can be a citizen of everywhere of the world, and decided to kind of valorize that. So you got this. Now, I mean, it was so. I mean, it ended up just being quite funny, and therefore I think easy to. It was so open to ridicule that you could see how quickly it collapsed. I mean, the book, it was just withdrawn. The minister disassociated herself from it, and so on and so forth, because it did that thing to such a. I mean, okay, by the way, the other thing I'd say is the idea that a conservative family that their only view will be RTE is just like patently laughable.
They also they ate bacon and cabbage every day.
Yeah, I
That was
mean,
comedy. I mean,
yeah,
it was so ridiculous. It felt like you think, is this actually the other way around? Is this some kind of fifth columnist?
yeah.
Because
So I mean, that's what you actually wonder: did maybe some secret conservative slip in and just make this so bad? And then also the presentation of the cosmopolitan family, like, was like they eat, pasta, Asian, and I can't remember, but it was so kind of broad.
it was
It's like
pizza,
they just eat Asian
curry, and
foods.
Asian food.
Yeah, curry and
I thought
Asian
it was
food.
bizarre because curry isn't Asian somehow. But it's also terribly
Well,
disrespectful of other people's culinary culture.
well, also like two-thirds of the world is it lives in Asia. I mean, Asian
Yeah.
culture is not, I mean, there's a variety. So it just again, and actually weirdly produced this kind of, I suppose, strange type of Western view of the world with us and then like
Mm.
Asian, whatever, vaguely out there. So it did almost look like it was written. I don't know, but you definitely got the effect they were probably driving it. I mean, because the family was presented being exciting. They were obviously visiting loads of places, whatever else, you know. And then I think what was it? One of the kids wanted to play hockey in the Woolly Jumper family, and they weren't allowed, or you know, it was no, it was risible. But this was the problem, I suppose. A lot of us focused on other elements of those textbooks and we're making certain observations of them. But other stuff slipped through. And it's funny, it's some of the stuff that makes it into the curriculum where we'll be alive to certain things, parents be alive, they talk to their kids at home. But like other aspects then are just a little bit more insidious almost that to promote a
Mhm.
certain attitude towards your own nation and your own nation's culture that is very negative. You know?
And I suppose maybe the lesson there, unfortunately, is for parents. They need to read these books.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll be straight up as well. Look, it was funny, not funny, but I mean it was interesting to see the ASTI, who are there's two main teacher trade unions at post primary schools. So ASTI, they mainly represent teachers in the faith schools. TUI generally do the state sector. Now there's obviously lots of
Crossover.
that isn't true across the way, but anyway, generally there. But the ASTI issued advice to their members: don't use the textbooks. Review the online resources and double check with school management in terms of what the ASTI kind of coyly referred to as controversial topics. To check in with school management about like what exactly do you want to teach in this. So that was advice coming from the trade union, which was based on some of the members reporting back, one, opening up some of these textbooks and kind of going, I'm not teaching this, or this is going to get me in serious trouble with parents. Or just the teacher was reluctant, not just from a parental point of view, but just reluctant in themselves to teach some of the content. So they went back to their union and the union basically said, don't, or advised them not to. Now, with ASTI, our advice has been exactly the same: don't use textbooks. They're not written in line even with the specification of the NCCA, and they're certainly not sympathetic to the ethos of schools. And in fairness to parents, if they sign up to a school and every school has an admissions notice and it says this is what the school is, those parents have a legitimate right to expect that that's the ethos that will be delivered. And even those
Hmm.
parents who are sending their school to or sending their child to a school with an ethos they mightn't entirely agree with, but at least if they have clear visibility of what their child is going to be taught or an expectation, then at least they know what to talk to their child about at home. So let's say a Muslim child coming to Catholic school. Again, no problem from our point of view. But if you're going to teach something completely different, then we're into a situation where you've smuggled in another set of values, country that advertised, and effectively parental rights have been undermined. And there is a huge push. I mean, the push to get the church out of education isn't really about the church. And we'll get onto this when you ask me about mandatory. It's really to do with getting parents out. And it's to decide that education should be a matter for experts,
Yeah.
which is contrary to international human rights conventions, the European Human Rights Convention, and our own constitution. And certainly contrary to the Catholic view of education. The only reason the church is involved in education is because parents want us there.
It's very interesting. I read an article recently which said that the decisions about education should be made by citizens. I thought it was
Yeah,
an interesting choice of word. Not parents,
yeah,
citizens. Now maybe I'm projecting here, but I could hear the music of the revolution happening in Robespierre, Citizen
yeah,
Robespierre and Citizen Danton talking to each
yeah.
other.
Well,
And that's the sense of getting, yes, as you say, getting the parents out, because the parents are not qualified.
yeah, and that citizen thing actually is a problem. The Constitution doesn't leave education to citizens; it leaves education to parents. And also, about a fifth, at least a fifth of our parent body are not Irish citizens. They're foreign born. And again, I think maybe the same guy who said that citizens should influence the education system, in fairness to him, he'd probably object if we said we were going to exclude foreigners from that. But that's the
Hmm.
implications of saying citizens.
Yes.
I mean, you're cutting out like a fifth. Now, he'd probably resign. I mean, I think if he thinks through what he's trying to say. But again, the attitude probably is because who exercises that citizen right? Well, the state. And who informs the state? Experts. So citizen is just an abstraction. Really, parents are where this is supposed to be grounded.
So
And not just our country. Yeah,
recently there has been talk and there be in the papers, and it's slightly confusing, but you referred to the
yeah,
constitutional situation that that SPHE is going to be mandatory. This is the word that has been
yeah.
used. What does this mean? What?
Okay. Okay, there's a couple of different levels to this. One part is there's been allegations by certain NGOs that those awful Catholic schools are not teaching any sex education whatsoever. And unless a gun is put to the back of their head, they just won't teach any of this at all. And worse still, they won't even teach about consent because, for reasons I've never quite been able to fathom, a lot of these NGOs seem to have the view that the church has something against consent. Obviously, we don't, but we just view it. I think Breeda O'Brien wrote in this recently, Irish Times. We just view it as being so baseline. There's so much else other than consent required in those considerations that we just see it. I suppose we get surprised at the animation they put into it. I mean, we agree with them, but just we think there's so many other important things that have to go alongside consent. But in any event, they have the view we're not going to teach this, so we have to be forced to do it. So it's now mandatory to teach this thing. Now, the thing is, it's been mandatory for schools to teach the SPHE curriculum at primary and junior cycle for several years now under the Child Protection Procedures, the Children First Act. This has been a requirement on schools. Schools have been doing it. And Catholic schools have no difficulty teaching relationship sexuality education from the point of view of our own ethos, what schools should be doing, or teaching consent. But again, it's kind of part of the propaganda battle against faith schools that unless these guys are forced to do it, so they won't do it. And it kind of paints us as being, insidious or whatever else. So part of that mandatory thing is just propaganda, to be frank, against faith schools. The other part of it, though, is a little bit, it's actually worse because it's what they're saying and then what they're not saying. So from here on in, schools will also have to teach SPHE at senior cycle. Now, that's all it's really meant by being mandatory. That's a new bit of mandatory from the state's point of view. What though is coming across in the messaging is that this is mandatory for pupils to attend those classes.
Okay.
Now, that is not the case. There's still, everything from the European Convention on Human Rights to our Constitution to the Education Act guarantees parents the right to withdraw their child from any subject, and particularly subjects that touch on philosophical or religious beliefs or values. So parents absolutely retain the right to withdraw their child from SPHE or any aspect of SPHE they wish to do so. For that matter, they can withdraw their children from other subjects too. And like that's where the Women's Council, I suspect, weren't talking about mandatory for schools just to teach it. I suspect they also meant that everybody had to receive it. And again, a lot of these people don't come straight out with it to kind of talk about what they really mean.
Mm-hmm.
And just a clarity, by the way, students over 18 are perfectly entitled to recuse themselves from these classes as well, because they can make decisions over their own education at that point. So it was being thrown around a lot. It caused some confusion, but I think some of that confusion was possibly intentional. And I said the other aspect then is just it's a kind of propaganda value. So that's where a lot of that stuff was coming from. But to be straight, just to be very, very clear to any of your viewers or any of our viewers, they absolutely retain the legal right to withdraw their child from this. The other thing I'd say to you is quite a number of parents are exercising that opt-out. So do not be afraid that your child will be on their own. And I will say that opt-outs are an increasingly common feature of education system. So again, when it comes to opt-outs from religious education, this is what was it, we're horrible schools doing this. The thing is, opt-outs are done all the time. There's no drama. And we trust the professionalism of teachers to handle these things sensitively with their pupils. So you're getting parents opting the kids out of PE, swimming, music, SPHE, religious education, so on and so forth. This is now just a regular feature of what schools have to deal with, and they just get on with it professionally. Professionally in vast majority of cases. There'll be some difficulties in parents to address that to the Board of Management. But this is not something odd, right? This is now something that's become a normal feature of education system, and parents should have some ease in that, I think. Okay.
Listening to what you've been saying on a number of different subjects tonight regarding the content of the courses and the content of books and the books that have been used, one thing that has come across that I think we could maybe take as a positive is that there has been pushback, and the pushback has affected change. Now, I'm sure that there'll be many people out there who will look at this status and say, I'm not happy with this. I don't think it's gone far enough. It's not what I would like to see. It's imperfect. Even the materials produced by the hierarchy or whatever. But allowing for that, one thing we can take out from this is that if people do express their opinion and they do push back, that it isn't monolithic. You can actually affect a change.
Yeah, and people did. There was, look, it's not entirely what we would have hoped for, but there were significant changes made between the draft and final version of the junior cycle SPHE. Again, there's significant changes that were achieved. To give one example, at senior cycle, the allyship and privilege aspect is gone. and they're now using the language of kind of solidarity, you know, um, solidarity with those who are facing persecution or discrimination, rather than the kind of allyship and privilege thing, which
Mhm.
is another disguised worldview coming in. That's gone, and that's gone based on the fact that loads of people went to the bother of engaging in submission, contacting people, doing all the hard work of actually, sitting down and dedicating time to it. It does pay off. Now, there were things we didn't get, and I'd just say the one big one was marriage. And again, we just have this thing. We just after having two referendums where we're wrapped up in ideas about marriage, that the fundamental unit of society under the Irish Constitution is a family grounded on marriage.
Mhm.
But there was a refusal by the state to put marriage into the SPHE curriculum. Even though we know that marriage promotes an awful lot of social good and an awful lot of individual good. Again, not in all cases, but we know that the effect of marriage on society for individuals is broadly positive and and actually dramatically positive in many ways, particularly outcomes for children in general. But there again, reluctance to actually talk about marriage. Now, we talk about marriage in our resources, and we're producing resources for senior cycle, and they'll hopefully be published soon. And again, marriage gets a large treatment in our resources. But even just taking the general view of the education system, that's a big gap that we're not going to talk about that's not in the curriculum. And that is a serious failing. But there were other positives. And again, actually, I think even the hardening of the line of pornography was interesting because, again, that came from public reaction to earlier perceptions about what was maybe being proposed. So do keep acting. Yeah.
We'll be coming back to more details and more specific issues regarding the SPHE and on other occasions. And any questions that haven't been addressed tonight, people should keep sending them in, because the next time we'll be dealing specifically with any questions that haven't been addressed. So before you go, there was another issue that has become, it comes and goes. It's never a finished project. You mentioned there that the push to get the Catholic Church out of education is more actually about getting parents out. And I think there's a truth, may well be that, but there is also a push to get the Catholic Church out. And I'm saying Catholic Church specifically, but maybe that's the beginning of it. But if you could maybe remind, because I think a lot of people maybe have forgotten or maybe weren't aware, there was a piece of legislation introduced by, I think, Richard Bruton, which
Yep.
was only applied, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to be wrong, it was only applicable to Catholic schools, which is
Well,
now having a kind of a weird, I imagine, unintended consequence, because there's a demand for divestment. And I want to, if you can remember this, I'd also like to come back to the issue about when parents are polled about divestment, what actually is the consequence of that. But it's having a weird unintended consequence on the issue of divestment. So could you tell the people what was this bill and what it did?
well, Richard Bruton bought this bill. Now, there's other aspects to the bill. So you and I are really only talking about one aspect. So,
Yeah.
brought in things like a certain form of admissions notice, admissions policy, whatever else. But one aspect of it said that basically the effect is that Catholic schools alone cannot prioritize. So if a school has 50 places to offer, but they get 60 applicants, before this bill came in, the Catholic school could have prioritized those who were baptized Catholics. So, and given them the places first. We, you know what I mean? So we have lost now that ability. But the Protestant schools, the Muslim school, the Jewish school, they can all still prioritize members of their faith for enrollment. So Catholic schools alone may not do so, right? But other faith schools may. Now, what happens is when we go out into communities and we say, look, there's 4 schools in this parish, we might look at divesting one. The parents, in a lot of the cases, and the Dublin diocese had, there was a recent pilot divestment project that had looked at areas all over the country. There was huge engagement in every one. There was 150 meetings in Dublin alone with various different communities carried out by a department official and people from the diocese. And over again, well, one, there was a general actual liking for Catholic education, and not just from Catholics. We actually, from people of other faiths, valued Catholic schools and didn't wish the school to become another type. But we also had a lot of parents go, hang on a second. So if we go from 4 Catholic schools to 3, am I still guaranteed to get my kid into a Catholic school as a Catholic parent? And the answer came back, well, no, we can't guarantee that anymore. And you could end up going to this other school. So the parents would then go, well, on that basis, why would I consent to this?
Mm-hmm.
Why would I risk not being able to access a Catholic school? Why am I going to sign up for this? Why not just have what I hold? So that aspect of the legislation, I mean, Bruton brought it in because there was lobby groups, this baptism barrier campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we looked at it in detail in Dublin. There was about something like 496 kids in the last year of operation before Bruton enacted this piece of legislation. 496 children refused places in terms of schools where they enrolled. Now, they all eventually found a place, but they were refused a place in a school. Of those, about 30 something kids were refused on the basis that they weren't baptized Catholics. So this is a very small problem, a tiny problem, right? And in any event, the number of kids refused a place remained the same the following year because the problem wasn't the require, Catholic schools prioritizing Catholics. The problem was too few school places because the state hadn't, and what a surprise everybody when I say this, the state hadn't engaged in proper planning for
No.
school places in areas of population. I know, stunning.
Shocked.
So they just failed to plan for population growth in certain areas. And like lo and behold, there was a shortage of school places. So they used a sledgehammer to crack a nut, which brought in the first piece of anti-Catholic legislation since penal laws. I mean, because this is legislation specifically aimed at schools. Richard Bruton was told at the time this is going to cause a difficulty when we come back to divestment. And he didn't listen. And lo and behold, it has now emerged as one of the blocks in communities who might be happy to investigate the idea further, but on the basis that we still don't get our Catholic schools, so why are we going to, you know? So we've communicated this back, and it's going to have to change. Now, there's a 5-year review built into the legislation. Next year, that review is taking place. Certainly, when it comes to that, we've been encouraging parents to engage with that review process. We'll be doing it ourselves as well. But like, if the state wants to get divestment done, it needs to change its legislation. And this is kind of we told you so, but we did tell them so.
Mm-hmm.
So it needs to go.
Just generally, if off the top of your head, if you know, maybe you don't. Generally speaking, what is the reaction when you go to a community and they say, well, would you like to change over? Because it's not just a question of ethos, it's also a question of pedagogy as well, I suspect, that different places have different pedagogies. Not all pedagogies are as appreciated by
Well,
parents as others. So is there a large appetite? Are people hungry for divestment, or are most people saying, no, actually, I'm happy enough to keep it as?
well, yeah, most people seem to be happy at the status quo. Now, some of those are happy as for a variety of different reasons. They want a Catholic
Mhm.
school. They're happy at the school as it is. Why risk changing it? Um, some of them though just maybe don't like the alternative. And I'm not obviously those other schools are popular, but not popular with all parents.
Mhm.
And for instance, and again, there's variety even within the other patrons. Not all their schools, no more than our schools. Not every school. There's variety. Within our own schools, there's huge variety in terms of
Sure.
how schools approach being Catholic. But so, and similarly with schools that call themselves multi-denominational, um, there's variety in how they approach being multi-denominational because there's no real definition of that term. And a lot of parents of faith. And this is something that's common, by the way, over in the UK as well, in their state schools that again are supposed to be inclusive. I'm just going to say Muslim families, but other faiths are included in this. They are promised a multi-denominational school with equal respect. They send their child there, but what they find is that faith as a phenomenon in society is simply ignored, or it's dealt with in a way where they experience it to be slightly hostile. And they actually find then Catholic schools are simply more they're more open to faith as a phenomenon in human life, even if that faith is not our own. That we can respect the fact that other people have their own faith beliefs and customs
Mhm.
and heritage and all that kind of stuff. And they have found in Catholic schools greater welcome for them and a greater understanding that at least, even though they don't share a faith, we are at least other people of faith.
Sure.
So again, there's lots of complexity why there's stuff there, and sometimes staff are just worried about various different other arrangements. So it's a complex thing. And this is the other thing, like any idea you can just wave a magic wand, hold a poll, change the school. There's got to be serious work done on a local level wherever this emerges. So there's going to be surveys at some stage in the near future. And even where a survey shows that there's appetite for divestment, the state is still going to have to invest significant resources to engage that community. Because nobody's actually, I mean, some of those calling for divestment just want a top-down solution. When you see this in certain writers and newspapers, also certain campaign groups. You know, we know best. We just impose it from the top down. We're actually trying to engage communities, which is painful and slow and requires patience. But that's the only way to do this, because the Catholic patrons, even though the schools are kind of theirs, they recognize that these schools belong to the community. It's the communities that have nurtured these schools, looked after them, raised money for them. So you can't just ride roughshod over a community and say, well, this is what we're doing, like it or lump it. And in fairness, the department isn't minded to do it either. So regardless how many campaigning groups desire it.
And I'm aware that you have a very important meeting that you have to get to, and I'll release you. I'm sure we'll be talking again sometime, probably in the fairly near future. So I'd like to thank Alan. I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. Again, hit the subscribe button if you can, hit the donate button to support us in the causes that support the values that we share. That would be great. But for tonight, thank you very much, and thank you, Alan.
Cheers, Michael. Thank you.